Hello, my name is Dr. Ariel Hessayon, and today we're going to be introducing you to one of our Goldsmiths webinars. My talk will be called Radicalism During the English Revolution. But before I start, I'd like to introduce to you Rachel, my colleague in student marketing.
Hello there, thanks for joining us today. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat function and I will ask Ariel at the end of his webinar. Thanks, Ariel.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm just going to share my screen, which I hope you can all see. So here's my PowerPoint, and I'd like to begin with my title, which is perhaps a little bit more problematic than it might look at first glance. Let's take the word English Revolution. I'm well aware that one of your A-levels, the AQA, talks of an English Revolution. But is that the appropriate name to call the events that we'll be discussing? Are there alternative ways of thinking about the period? Well, the answer is yes. My screen isn't scrolling. Finally. Little technical hiccup there, sorry about that. Let's have a look at some of the ways in which this period has been called. The first way to think about the period is as a rebellion or a revolt. This has long antecedents. We think of a contemporary, Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, who wrote of the history of the rebellion and civil wars. Now, the point of calling it a rebellion is that it delegitimates what happened. It's a break from the natural order here being monarchy and the divine right of kings. Or we can take that further. We've got an echo firstly in Clarendon's title in Ivan Roots' The Great Rebellion. But we can think of John Adamson's The Noble Revolt, the overthrow of Charles I. Here, it's not even a rebellion, it's merely a revolt. And a noble revolt links these events to what happened earlier in English history, to baronial revolts against a monarch. On this reading, what we see in the period is really a fight amongst the elites, amongst the aristocracy. The popular element is relegated, is sidelined, and the people merely become pawns in a larger power struggle. Let's take another alternative contemporary view. It's a time of discord, a time of troubles. This has authority in William Dugdale, The Short View of the Late Troubles in England, or an echo in Jonathan Scott's England's Troubles in a wider 17th century European context. We can talk, of course, of civil war or civil wars, but that will only cover part of the period. Here an example is the poet and historian Thomas May's A Breviary of the History of the Parliament of England. Here, civil war is important because what it does is it connects the history of England with classical history, particularly ancient Rome, which is what May and other writers had in mind, and the civil wars that afflicted the Roman Republic. So this is very much positioning English history as part of a trajectory stemming from classical history. But English Civil War doesn't, of course, by its very name, talk about events in Wales or Scotland or Ireland. So perhaps we should talk, instead of English civil wars, of British civil wars. And here again, we have contemporary authority. They didn't use the word British, but they did talk of late intestine war in the three kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland, 1663, or civil wars in England, Wales, and Ireland. So British civil wars or wars of the three kingdoms gives a broader dimension, is more appealing to historians. And that still only takes us really up until the end of 1651. It doesn't give us the last 9 years of our period. Now the final one on this slide isn't actually used, but both the terms are coined by my former supervisor, John Morrell. Firstly, the idea of England as a war of religion rather than a secular conflict, linking it back particularly to the French wars of religion of the 16th century. And then, and this one really didn't take off, the idea that the British Isles is really an Atlantic archipelago, so that what we're looking at is a wars of religion in the Atlantic archipelago. I said that those terms, the war terms, only really take us up to 46 or 48 or 51, depending which you adopt. So what about the period from 49 to 1660? Well, here we could go with an interregnum, literally the interval between the close of a monarch's reign and the accession of their successor. So in this case, between January 1649 and May 1660, an 11-year period. We have some, but not much, contemporary authority for this. We have England's confusion during its interregnum of 1660. And the term was popular in the 1970s. You can see, for example, a collection of essays edited by the late Gerald Aylmer. What then of an English republic, which gives the idea that there is in fact governmental authority in charge between 49 and 1660? That has an appeal, but it conflates two separate developments, both the Commonwealth and its successor regime, the Protectorate. So perhaps we should split up the Republic into a Commonwealth Protectorate, as the historian William Godwin did, talking of a history of the Commonwealth, or Gardner's history of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. But if we break up the period into wars and interregnums and republics, or war, Commonwealth and Protectorate, what we're not doing is giving the period any sense of unity, any sense of cohesion. It is just one damn thing after another, to quote from a play. So what then of this notion of an English revolution? Well, contemporaries didn't use the term. In fact, looking back, the earliest example I found of an English revolution is of 1789. The date is very significant because that, of course, is the year of the French Revolution. And in this instance, the English revolution that George Berkeley had in mind was not the events of the period we're discussing today from 41 to 60, but rather the sometimes called Glorious Revolution of 1688. In fact, it takes a Frenchman, Francois Guizot, to popularize the idea of an English revolution, as he did in a 2-volume study published in 1826-7. Here, Guizot has a deliberate point to make. By calling it an English revolution, he's deliberately linking events in England to those in France. On this reading, the English Revolution becomes one of a sequence of revolutions, one of the things that helps inaugurate modernity. But should we just think of one English revolution? We've noted obviously a glorious revolution. What about going to another extreme, that the entire century is one of revolution? Something that Christopher Hill adopted in his Century of Revolution, covering a very long period until the end of the Stuarts, 1603 to 1714. Or a slightly shorter period, Austin Woolwich's Britain in Revolution, again, covering a period there, 25 to 60, larger than my time frame. Maybe we need to get away from the idea of a revolution. Now, I said that the term would be unintelligible to contemporaries. And that's because for contemporaries, revolution is a concept associated with astronomy. If we think about it, planets revolve around the sun. In our period, Copernican heliocentrism, so the idea that the Earth orbits around the sun rather than the sun orbits around the Earth, was becoming dominant. So what planets did was they completed one revolution around the sun, the Earth obviously taking 365.25 days. If we think of the events that are happening in England as a revolution, as a circle, then what some contemporaries saw was that circle half completed during our period, only 180 degrees rather than a full 360 degrees. If, of course, you start at the top of the circle and go through 180 degrees, what you have done is turned everything upside down. And that is exactly how some contemporaries saw the period, as a world or the world turned upside down. For example, on the left, we see John Taylor illustrating a world turned upside down, which gave inspiration for Christopher Hill's classic study of the period, A World Turned Upside Down, published in the early 1970s. The title itself, the upside down part, comes from English translations of the prophet Isaiah. But it also introduces us to another concept that's very important besides that of revolution, which I'll get to in a moment. Firstly, if the world is upside down at 180 degrees, then it is the right way up when the 360-degree circle has been completed. So in this reading, the world has been turned upside down during the middle of the revolution and is right way up with the restoration of the monarchy. A complete revolution has been completed. That's how 17th century people would have understood the concept of revolution, rather than our more modern sense, which comes from the French. Now, I noted that the upside down part was also element. You can see in the John Taylor illustration here, many examples of things that are upside down, literally the horse before the cart, church upside down. This links us to something that Stuart Clark in his work on witchcraft identified as being extremely important for our period, namely the idea of inversion. Contemporaries quite often thought in terms of binaries: good, evil, light, dark, lots of other examples. The point is that they had an idealized vision of something. In the case of witchcraft, for example, the ideal woman. And the witch was therefore the exact opposite, the antithesis of that idealized type. So when we look at some of the hostile literature to the so-called radicals, which I'll get to in a moment in this time, what they're not really talking about is what they're seeing, but they're the opposite of the ideal they imagine. Now, I mentioned radical and radicalism. And just as revolution was used in one sense in our period, so radical was also used in one sense in our period, but not in the way that we mean it today. In our period, radical is mainly a term used in philosophy or astrology or philology, the study of words. And what it's really about is getting to the roots of something, getting back to their origins, to their original state. Radicalism, the second part of my title, isn't actually a word used in any political sense until the early 19th century. As we see here, probably coined by the founder of UCL, Jeremy Bentham, in about 1819. Now that leads to a substantial problem. Radicalism is therefore anachronistic. It's not a word that exists in the 17th century, even if the word radical does. So can we use anachronistic words to talk about the past? And if we do, does that distort the meaning of the past? Should we only use words from the time to talk about the past, to give a better flavor, a better sense of what contemporaries think? But then if we do, how do we make it intelligible to people who haven't spent years, in my case, far too many years, studying this period? Well, that's a problem. And what it's resulted is in, I would say, different approaches to the study of early modern English radicalism and radicalism during the English Revolution in particular. I've outlined the three major types of approach, and I'll explain what I mean by each in turn. Following Glenn Burgess's work, I've decided to call them the substantive, the nominalist, and the functional. The substantive approach is particularly associated with Marxist historians and their fellow travelers, so people like Christopher Hill and the like. And this is the idea that there is a continuous, identifiable, single English radical tradition. But it begins usually with the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though some people have tried to stretch it back, I'm not in agreement here, as far as Magna Carta. and that it goes through into the 19th century to the Chartists, the modern working class movement, and the rise of trade unionism in the 1890s. The purpose of creating a radical tradition, a substantive tradition, was twofold. Firstly, to diffuse the charge that communism in England was a foreign import. That in fact, radicalism, communism, dissent were native to England. And secondly, to restore to the English people a history that they'd been deprived of, one that had been silenced in the official records by elites who had been scared of radicalism. They'd been afraid of the type of things that radicalism could unleash. The problem with that approach, the substantive, is that it often draws connections between things that may not exist. And you're left with the idea that there is an underground for which we have no sources to provide continuities. Continuities are certainly important, and it's something we need to think about whether, and this perhaps we can come to in the questions, whether the radicalism that we see during our English Revolution is in fact itself based on older ideas, whether those ideas stem from England or from Europe or from both. Our second approach is the nominalist. This is an extreme approach that we would associate with what we call revisionists. This is the idea that radicalism quite simply did not exist until it was named. The word was invented in the 19th century. So if we want to speak about politics, we can't use the word. It's anachronistic to do so. Radicalism doesn't exist in the 17th century. There's no name for it. There's two aspects to this. Firstly, if we do this, then as I've said already, we have to get rid of every single word that doesn't exist before the 17th century when writing about the 17th century, which is impossible. And even proponents of this idea recognize that it's probably a forlorn hope to strip our language to such an extent. The second, and this is part of, again, the revisionist attack on the Marxists, is essentially what you're trying to do is to minimize the significance of radicalism in English history, and particularly the English Revolution. It's not important, it's marginal. It was exaggerated by panicked contemporaries who were afraid of property damage and also of quite possibly the terror that could be unleashed with radicalism. Moreover, many of the famous radical figures of the period are said not to be radical from birth, even if they're occasionally radical at death, but rather merely to have radical episodes. Again, a downplaying of radicalism. Our third approach is a functionalist. Radicalism exists at certain times and places and can be recognized by the functions it performs. So on this reading, what radicalism does is it explains how we get from A to B. It explains how we get from 1641 to 1649. It explains how we get from a rebellion in Ireland to the execution of Charles I. Now, that can be quite attractive. And it also alerts us to something else that many sociologists and historians have been long aware of, which is the importance of context, that we cannot understand radicalism outside of its immediate contexts. Because what is radical at one moment may not be at another. A position that someone may hold consistently in 1641, such as, for example, arguing for the abolition of episcopacy, government of the church by bishops, could be completely and utterly outmoded by the time we get to 1649. So context is extremely important, and it gives us the sense that what is radicalism constantly fluctuates during our period. Now, I've noted so far English Revolution and radicalism. And I've suggested that ideas may come either directly from England or from abroad, from the continent. So before even exploring what these ideas were, it's probably worthwhile asking ourselves, how did these ideas actually spread and come into being? Well, ideas can be spread in our period primarily through speech, or through writing, and occasionally visually. In speech, there are many places and spaces in which the spoken word, political discussion, radical religious ideas, note that I'm quite happy using the word, take place. Inside the home, of course, but also open spaces, marketplaces, for example, doorsteps, alehouse, the church. And there's been a lot of debate about whether particular spaces foster political and radical discussions. Some very good work, for example, on where dangerous words, the idea that radical words can be spoken when you're in your cups, when you've had a couple of drinks in the alehouse. Not yet in this period, though it will come into a later period, is the radical space of the coffee shop, where people of a particular social class will be having their coffee and reading the newspaper and discussing politics. In a pre-pandemic time, you might think of exactly the same thing. You might not talk politics, but doubtless you talk with your friends. Now we also have, besides speech, we have writing. Writing is spread in two different ways in our period, both in manuscript and in print. Print, of course, is not a new invention by the time we get to the English Revolution of 1641 to 1660. Indeed, by the end of our period, Gutenberg's invention has been around for more than 200 years. But what is noticeable is just how many titles were printed in our period. If you actually count each individual title, and yes, historians have attempted to do this, we know that more than 33,000 titles were printed by English speakers, predominantly in the British Isles, between 1641 and 1660. It's roughly 26% of all titles between Caxton and 1700. So in a 225-year period, 25% roughly of all titles come in our 20-year period. We can even plot this on a map. I don't know if you can see my, Rachel, not if you can see my cursor or not.
Yes.
You can see the cursor. Perfect. Thank you. So you can see quite clearly here the trend in annual outputs. And then all of a sudden, you get this in 1641, again in 48, 49, little peak here in 53, then again in 59, 60. Now, we're still arguing precisely about how many titles come out in each year, but that doesn't really matter for our purposes. What we see are general trends. And what we need to do is explain these general trends. And the first noticeable thing is the huge amount of titles that come out in 41, and indeed continue to come out in our three peaks up until 1660. Why has this happened? Well, what's happened is that censorship has broken down. Firstly, Charles I has been deprived of two courts, the Court of Star Chamber and the Ecclesiastical Court of High Commission. There are three different types of censorship. There's self-censorship, where you're careful about what you say, in case you give offense to someone, either because you don't want to give offense or because you're afraid of the consequences. There's pre-publication censorship, where you're careful about what you say up to a point, and somebody will then censor what you say and decide whether it can or can't be printed. This is the type of censorship that we have up until 1640. And often at this point, works are given an official license. The licensor doesn't have to censor the whole work. They can in fact moderate the opinions, but there is some level of control being exercised about what is allowed to go out in the realm of print and be distributed to readers. The third type is post-publication censorship, where you censor something after the event. So you can no longer control its spread, but once it's out, if it's particularly blasphemous or seditious or objectionable in any other way, you then try and find out who printed it and published it and wrote it and punish them, smashing up their press, fining them, imprisoning them, and in extreme cases, we find even publicly burning their books. I mean, the author who has more books burned in this period than any other is the Leveller leader, John Milburn. So we can see what's happening here. Quite clearly in 1641, what we see is the breakdown of pre-publication censorship. No longer can there be a control on what is coming out. There is some attempt at control what comes out afterwards, And there's various legislation. We'll see, for example, here, John Milton in his vindication of free speech, Areopagitica, on the left, or on the right, an ordinance actually against unlicensed scandalous pamphlets. But the next question we have to ask ourselves is, how else can we explain this? Is it also about the breakdown of pre-publication censorship? Or is there more going on? Is there more paper available than ever before? Well, no, there isn't actually. Most of the paper mills are damaged during the Civil War. The paper that they print on is white paper. The English paper mills tend to produce brown paper, which is for packing. And most of the white paper that they print on is imported from Geneva and from the Dutch Republic. There's not more paper then. What about technology? Is there a technological revolution? Is printing cheaper and quicker than before? Well, no, there isn't a technological revolution either. What changes, and this is particularly significant for much of the material, the ephemeral material to an extent that we look at when studying radicalism, is the nature of the publication changes. Rather than having very large works, 600, 700, 800, even 1,000-page work, often biblical commentaries, you have much smaller items, 8 pages, 16 pages, 32 pages. And what you do is you change the size of the book. A very large, expensive book is printed on a folio, which is one sheet of paper folded to produce writing on 2 sides. You can fold that again so that one sheet of paper then produces an 8-page pamphlet. Here, sorry, a quarto, 4 pages, and then again 8, and then 16. So the books become smaller as you keep folding your paper into smaller and smaller units. You can even produce 32s, and so you get more pages, more publications, but the same amount of paper. Also, what we have in this period, I won't dwell too long on this, are more news books. Rather than annual news, daily newspapers, sorry, you have weekly news books. And you can see with the breakdown of pre-publication censorship, if you follow the graph, how in some years you can have almost 70 titles just prior to the regicide. So there's a huge amount more information than was ever available before. And that helps mobilize opinion. Now, who are we talking about? What sort of radical groups, movements, sects, communities? Well, I've only got a little bit of time to run through some of the more famous. Let's take ones I'm sure you've probably all heard of, namely the levelers. The name leveler, first of all, we have to note, is a hostile term, a term of abuse. The idea that people want to level social distinctions, to make everybody equal, which from the perspective of the elites is not a comfortable proposition. The term itself isn't actually used until November 1647, just after the Putney debates outside London. But it's quite clear from a lot of recent research that the coalition that forms the leveler movement comes into being at least in the summer of 1646. And indeed, many of the people involved in that knew each other prior to that. Amongst the key figures are John Lilburne, a man who never shut up and indeed could start an argument in an empty room. On the left, shown there, age 23 in 1641, and on the right, behind bars. Lilburne is frequently imprisoned, and in fact dies as a Quaker. What are the levelers' key ideas? Well, firstly, in the realm of politics, franchise reform. They want an extension on who can vote. There's been a great debate among historians about how far they want to go, but certainly these proposals are more radical than the status quo idea at the time. They also want parliamentary reform, regular elections, abolition of rotten boroughs. They want redress of legal rights. They want the language of the law reformed so that it's no longer in law French, but goes into English. They put initially a stress on Magna Carta, particularly the 29th chapter of the Revised Version of Magna Carta, the idea that every English man, and indeed woman, is entitled to a trial by their peers. And so on this basis, Lilburn says that the House of Lords have no authority to try him, and he can only be tried by commoners. And they also advocated religious toleration. This is particularly important, as we'll see in a moment, because many of them have a radical sectarian background. A number of historians working on them in the early 20th century saw them as a secular movement, precursors to modern social democrats even. And while there are certainly secular consequences in their thinking, I think it is a disservice to the many religious elements that we see in them. As I've noted that Lilburn dies as a Quaker, one of his contemporaries, Richard Overton, is also a Baptist. So we have to also fully acknowledge this. And another one, William Wallin, is accused of denying the authority of the Bible. So here we can see some of the Leveller ideas promoted through an agreement of the people. Now, I noted their sectarian background, and some of the Levellers definitely have a Baptist background, called by hostile observers Anabaptists. Baptists are people who believe in adult baptism rather than infant baptism. They argue that very small children have no awareness of what is going on at the time, and hence only adults have full consciousness in being able to decide when they should be baptized. So originally, the first Baptists took on a second baptism, one as an adult in addition to one as a child, and hence they were called Anabaptists. Now, by some of their contemporary opponents, what we call heresiographers, the chroniclers of heresy, the Anabaptists are seen as the fountain spread, the origin of all heresies. And we can see here on the left an illustration of the various types of Anabaptists, some real, some imagined. But if you look particularly on the top, you can see that in the minds of their enemies, quite clearly there's a diabolic inspiration for this. And here the Baptists being baptized in the River Jordan, echoing Christ's baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan. I've noted the Baptist background of some of the Levellers, and we'll see in a moment the Baptist background of some of the Diggers, and indeed some of the Ranters. Other groups are those who deny the authority of the Ten Commandments, the law of Moses, called sometimes antinomians. They believe that because of Jesus Christ's death on the cross, these no longer apply to Christians at a moment of the apocalypse. Shown here in another hostile representation with somebody literally taking an axe to the Ten Commandments. Now, I mentioned the Diggers. The Levellers are very keen to disassociate themselves from the Diggers. The Diggers have been called, quite fairly, I think, England's first communists. They've also recently been called, though perhaps not with as much justification, England's first Greens. Their leader, Gerard Winstanley, was from Wigan. He was a merchant tailor. So too was his compatriot, William Everard, co-founder of the Diggers, another merchant tailor, probably from Reading. And in April 1649, we're not exactly sure about the date. Most textbooks will tell you it's the 1st of April. I'm not sure if it's the 1st or the 8th. They establish effectively a commune on St. George's Hill in Surrey, near the parish of Walton upon Thames. The Diggers don't last very long. Most of the people around them don't like them, and they don't like their ideas. But what they preach is a sense of community of goods, of having all things common. But only possessions, not women, which I'll get to in a moment, which they regard as community of women. Winstanley promotes these ideas in a number of pamphlets, which the Marxist historians who looked at them initially attempted to minimize the religious element. We have to remember here that Winstanley is also an apocalyptic thinker, as well as having Baptist roots in this idea. The basis of Digger communism is the Bible, particularly the Acts of the Apostles, Acts chapter 4. And Winstanley gives it a slightly Baptist and mystical edge, justifies the experiment with a vision, and believes essentially that because of Christ rising up in him and his followers, they're able to live in community with each other. They're opposed by the local priests, whose churches they don't attend, and by the local landowners, to whom they don't give obedience. And while they're destroyed, the legacy of their ideas live on, so that Winstanley is now recognised not only as one of the great prose writers of 17th century England, but also one of the great political thinkers. Now, I noted that Winstanley was against community of women, and indeed he is against the ranters, one of whom even infiltrates his community, Lawrence Clarkson. And that brings us to our next group, the ranters. There's been a major debate amongst historians as to whether the ranters even existed. I have to say I don't subscribe to that view. I'm quite firmly of the opinion that the ranters did exist. But what I do accept is that they are also the subject of exaggerated reports, that many of our sources about the ranters are not true. Let's take this example. On the left, an anti-Catholic pamphlet about what contemporaries consider to be a monstrous birth, the idea today of what we would call probably conjoined twins, but in this instance seen as a divine judgment by God against the sins of a country. So here, a Catholic woman in Lancashire has given birth to a misshapen creature. You can see the rosaries, the crucifix, various accoutrements, has given birth to a monster. That image is recycled and transferred onto the ranters. So here in an example of the ranters monster being a woman from Essex called Mary Adams, who believed she was going to give birth to the Messiah. It's not true. What we have is a war in print against the ranters, a polemical attack, inventing examples of more extreme behavior than actually happened. But that isn't to detract from the fact that there were ranters. Other examples of extreme polemical attacks on the ranters, firstly linking their ideas with the devil. You can see, for example, Beelzebub, Lucifer, Pluto supposedly at dinner with the ranters. Or here the idea that the ranters engage in all sorts of uncivilized behavior, naked dancing, anal kissing, and various other parodies of the Lord's Supper. We have to scrub away the dirt from the ranters and listen to what they have to say for themselves. Their most famous preacher and self-proclaimed prophet is a man from Warwickshire, Abiezer Copp, the author of a fiery flying roll and a second fiery flying roll. Copp has Baptist origins. He was a Baptist preacher at one point. And the ranters do believe in community not only of goods, but community of women too. They believe that all things should be shared. Here we see an apocalyptic message from Copp in which he adopts partly the guise of the prophet Ezekiel from the Bible. He also shows an element of something I've not talked much about yet, of Judaizing by writing his surname in Hebrew letters there, Copp. And what Copp does is he engages in a performance in London, a shocking performance, in which he wants to shock the rich through his behavior into repenting before the end of the world. He runs up and down and sticks his head into their carriages, molests almost gypsies in prison in Southwark. But really he's trying to warn people of the apocalypse in the same way that his predecessors, the Hebrew prophets, had done. Further examples of ranter writing, a justification of the Mad Crew, which is another name for them, the Mad Crew on the left, or A Single Eye, All Light, No Darkness by Lawrence Clarkson in New Winstanley, which argues there's no such thing as sin and no consequences for sinful behavior because we've all been saved. Or to take the final example I want to give you, the Quakers. Many contemporaries originally saw the Quakers as nothing but the ranters, with an element of hypocrisy. And indeed, some of the original anti-Quaker attacks merely recycled anti-ranter attacks. So you hear on the left, the Ranters' Declaration, here on the right, the Quaker's Dream. You can see that the woodcuts are the same, but that the captions have been replaced. That they've merely transferred one line of attack on one group onto one line of attack on another. It makes it difficult to know what Quakers believed. So we have to read for the Quakers themselves. What we have to appreciate is that the Quakers are far more radical before 1660 than they were afterwards. Their most charismatic figures were George Fox and James Naylor. They were apocalyptic. Fox and Naylor both believed in the imminent end of the world, and they both believed in the light within, the idea of the risen Christ within them. Naylor went much further and actually rode on horseback into the streets of Bristol in imitation of Christ's entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and didn't mind that people essentially mistook him for the person of Jesus Christ. In fact, he went so far as to grow his hair long, side parting, center parting, and was called the Quaker Jesus. He's punished, as many of you will know, eventually branded on the forehead with the letter B for blasphemer, bored through the tongue with a red hot iron, dragged through the streets of Bristol. You've seen the original offence, then from London. Returns home to Yorkshire, to Wakefield, and is mugged on the way in Huntingdonshire and dies. We can talk a bit more about the Quakers and the questions if you wish. But one of the things I want to emphasize about the Quakers, which is true to also to an extent of the Baptists, is the importance that they accord to women and how women have a significant role to play in the Quaker movement. Firstly, in the figure of Margaret Fell, one of the sponsors of George Fox and a letter writer in her own right. And secondly, particularly for the idea of female preaching, the idea that despite the female vessel, the weaker vessel as it was known at the time, women were perfectly entitled to preach and to speak publicly if in their minds they were filled with the Holy Spirit. Shown here in an attack on this woman. You'll note the way that she's dressed with a particular hat and a particular image, and there's been some good work to suggest that our modern ideas of how a witch looked is in fact based on hostile depictions of Quaker women. If you look at that and then imagine Wicked or something, you can probably see where I'm coming from. Now, I began with an image which I didn't talk much about of Oliver Cromwell watching while his followers hacked at the roots of a tree, a form of radicalism. But there's also a different type of propaganda of Cromwell as the bringer of peace and not an agent of radicalism, which may tie into a question as to whether he betrayed the revolution to seize power. On the left, you can see his initials embodied there in the sun of the O and the moon of the sea, the holy dove with olive leaf in its branch signifying peace above his head, the nations of England, Scotland, and Ireland playing homage, trampling on the whore of Babylon and the many-headed beasts, images of the Revelation linking them to the papacy, and here fertility in the bottom, the pruning, and an image reused in our second revolution of the period, the Glorious Revolution. And I think I'll conclude there.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Ariel. If you're able to unshare your screen, I do have a number of questions from our audience. You find it in the chat. So the first question is, I've heard this period described as the first bourgeois revolution. Do you agree with this view? And what role do you think radical ideas played in establishing capitalism in Britain?
Great question, thank you. Do I agree with the idea? No. It has been called that. It's an idea that was promoted particularly by the Marxist historians, Christopher Hill amongst them. And the idea here is that this is the first middle class revolution, the beginnings of the modern world. In a famous put down, the problem with this view, as somebody once said, is that yes, there were middling class, middling sorts, as we would call them today, fighting in the English Revolution, but they were fighting on both sides. The problem with this is that it uses class as an explanation for historical events. Class gives the motive for ideology and for action. But if that's the case, then we can't explain why people who have the same social background, sometimes even in the same family, pick different sides. So there has to be a more sophisticated way of looking at it. There is certainly social tension. It's certainly the case that Many of the people involved in the revolution come from a particular type of background. We think of Cromwell's background, we think of the army officer's background, and we think of the background of some, what Hill would call, rightly so, plebeians, much lower. So there is an element of social tension, most certainly, but it is realistic, I think, to just consider it in terms of a bourgeois revolution. In terms of what role did capitalism play in the spread of radical ideas, again, here more in terms of economic theory, there is definitely, for example, leveler objection to monopolies. So you could definitely make the case that some of the economic reforms that people are promoting, particularly the rebels would be, for example, but also other people in Parliament, are motivated by what we would today begin to think of as capitalism. And I would accept that in that respect, but that's only a very small part of some of the other ideas. But it has no bearing, I think, for example, on the religious, practically none whatsoever on the social or on the political, but certainly to an extent, yes, on the economic. Thank you. That's a good question.
A question from our audience is, how far do ideas shape history? I.e., how far did radical ideas shape this period and subsequent ones?
Fantastic questions today. I'm a historian of ideas, so I would say this, but I think ideas are crucial. I think that one of the things that I would like to think, I'm not alone in this, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, one of the things that people would suggest is that what makes the English Revolution particular are the ideas. It's a far more interesting period than merely a baronial revolt. This isn't just a power struggle. There is a whole swathe of different ideas competing, which generates the revolution, which generates all of the things that you just don't see in England 100 years before. And so I think ideas are absolutely central. For me, the question then becomes is, one of the things I was touching in the lecture is how, first of all, are these ideas transmitted, how they interpreted, and how they then spread and reinterpreted. And on a final point on that, one of the things that I've not been able to talk about in this, because we only have a little while, is, you know, to what extent can we connect the ideas of the English Revolution, the radical ideas in particular, with the ideas of a so-called radical Reformation? How much of what we're seeing is actually older European ideas that are flourishing in the mid-16th century? And how much of this is new, entirely new?
So another question we have, Ariel, is, I'm sorry if you already touched on this, it says, what do you think were the most significant political, religious and social radical ideas during this period?
Thanks. Another really good question. Nice and short, obviously. Huge amount of things to talk about here. I'm conscious we've only got about 5 minutes. Let me think. Apocalypticism, definitely. So the idea of the end of the world, sometimes called millenarianism, including claims to divine or prophetic status or various prophetic gifts, such as the gift of tongues. Christian, yeah, I see everyone coming in. Let me deal with this one. Christian primitivism. This is one that you may not be familiar with. The idea of returning the church back to an ancient church, uncorrupted by the papacy, going back to the Church of Christ and the Latter-day Apostles, which we see examples there in opposition to bishops, community of goods, but also against the idea of the church as a persecuting church. So religious toleration. We've got anti-clericalism, hostility to the clergy, hostility to payment of ministers by tithes, all sorts of attitudes to Jewish law, which flow into something which I talked about earlier, antinomianism, which is one of the ingredients in the rances, but also something I haven't talked about, which is Judaizing, which again links in with the end of the world. Some of the more extreme Puritans adopt Jewish names. Jewish customs, go so far as to circumcise themselves in extreme cases, take up Jewish dietary laws, adopt the Sabbath on a Saturday. And that's tied in with debates about the readmission of the Jews to England in 1655, and their tacit readmission in 1656. This is Puritanism and millenarianism resulting in something else. whole range of other ideas. I'm not even talked about political ideas of republicanism, social ideas of justice, but I'm conscious that other questions are coming up. But I would want to say one more thing as well, or else my friends who are literary scholars would get very annoyed if I don't mention this. There is also a radical shift in expression, in literary expression. We get new forms of prose, new forms of verse style, and even developments in vocabulary. We get new ways of writing as well as new ways of thinking. So that, I think, is also needs to be stressed.
So our next question, we've got nine more minutes, so I think we can do one or two more questions, hopefully. So the next question is, how far was subsequent radicalism a continuation of radicalism in this period?
Again, really, really, really good question. Depends how far you want to go. We definitely see the radicalism in the early Restoration period as a direct continuation of this. We see the former allies who'd split amongst themselves, arguing about what form England should take in the 1650s, unite under the banner of a good old cause under Charles II. You see a fear of that radicalism throughout the 1660s and into the 1670s. And arguably, some of the ideas of that radicalism go all the way through into the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89. Some of the figures even involved in the English Revolution are still active 40 years later, more or less, in the Glorious Revolution. I'm thinking, for example, particularly of John Wildman, would be a famous example. And if you've got vestiges of revolutionary radicalism in mid-century appearing in the English Revolution, in the Glorious Revolution, I'm sorry, in 88-89, then you can make a case for a much longer trajectory, because you can also make a case, as has been made in fact, that some of the ideas in the American Revolution draw particularly on the Glorious Revolution, plus Locke, obviously. And so in that sense, you could say that some of the ideas of the English Revolution go all the way through into the mid-18th century in the American Revolution. And indeed, you can even point to the fact that some of the ideas of American republicanism, some of the names hark back, that the memory of the English Revolution is still strong. Cromwell himself is commemorated in a number of places. Blair Worden's very good on this throughout the 19th century.
Wonderful. And I think we've got time for just one more question. So this one is, what, if anything, made, the English Revolution different, from what was happening elsewhere in Europe during the mid-17th century?
Oof, another really good question. Another one. How many minutes have I got on this one?
So we've got, I think we've got 3 or 4 minutes now.
Okay, so huge questions. Well, firstly, what else is happening in Europe at this time? We have, for example, in France, we have the Fronde, we have rebellion in Catalonia, in Portugal, in Naples, we have Masaniello's revolt. What do they share in common? One of the things I've not talked about is climate change. There is definitely a little ice age in this period that impacts everybody. I don't have time to talk about this. It's outlined in a 1,000-page book by Geoffrey Parker called The Global Crisis. What's different? The nature of the English state is quite different, both in terms of its structure, its revenue-raising capacity, and in terms of who has voting rights. But what's particularly different, I think, is the nature of what happens. The ideas themselves, the radicalism. There is certainly a political radical element, for example, in Masaniello's revolt, a sort of a break from Spanish authority and the Spanish monarchy. And the people behind Masaniello are probably promoting republicanism. And that shouldn't surprise us. Republican ideas, of course, have an origin in the Renaissance city-states, in Venice and particularly Florence. So English republicanism may not be particularly new, but Naples is a Catholic. France, predominantly Catholic with Huguenot dissenting minority. England, predominantly Protestant. It's Protestant, because there's no Pope, because individuals can claim divine authority by claiming an inspiration or revelation, that what we have is very different, is a religious radicalism that is, if not unique, then quite different from these other rebellions and revolts, which, as I say, shows more in terms of an echoing of the Radical Reformation than in terms of the contemporary crisis and elsewhere in Europe.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ariel, and thank you everyone for attending today. If you have any further questions, as I've mentioned in the chat, please email history-admissions@gold.ac.uk. Also, we do have some more webinars scheduled for the next couple of months, so please visit the history programme pages, and there's a link to the booking form there. Thank you so much. It's been very interesting. I've been thinking about my A-level history from many years ago, and I look forward to seeing some more of you at our future webinars. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.